guess maybe I can think about it, first of all, this the issue of 9/11, actually, because obviously 9/11 is so important in terms of how we conceive of the sacred and the sacrifice in the contemporary moment. Now, in the session next week, I want to deal with the question of technology, and I think this is really important. And I'll talk a bit about maybe my impetus actually for doing this volume came actually through a digital representation of COVID deaths. And I think the way in which we live in a heightened technologized state today, I think I'll preserve for next week. But I think the important thing, I think, really at the minute, in terms of thinking about 9/11 was 9/11 is a fundamental rupture, but which makes us realize how so much of our politics is dominated by narratives of the sacred, the sacrificial, and particularly post 9/11, the violence of ISIS and so on. So I think that's kind of maybe where I'll end perhaps a lot of the stuff today. I think a good place to start, and I want to go back because obviously I asked people to read through a number of the chapters, and maybe we can have more of a critical discussion around what you've read. And I hope, whoever's read through the stuff can maybe just we start unpacking some of it. But I want to kind of just go a bit of an outline back over some of the stuff on the sacred, because I think it's really important. And as you probably gathered, my intellectual kind of foundations for this analysis is very much in terms of the tensions and the conversations which kind of didn't happen remarkably between Agamben and René Girard. And I think there's, and I think actually it's quite strange why Agamben doesn't deal with Girard more, actually, especially in terms of trying to critique him more. But I think I'm coming into that kind of conversation. Obviously, what we talked last week about Walter Benjamin, and Benjamin's a really important thinker here. But certainly, I guess the model I really want to critique is René Girard. And I think, first of all, I think, I'm a strong believer in Gilles Deleuze's point about, we should never criticize anybody unless we believe they're formidable. And I think, as much as, I believe every student should read Carl Schmitt, because Schmitt is one of the most formidable thinkers of the 20th century. I also think the same for René Girard. I think René Girard is such a formidable, brilliant scholar. And that's why I think you have to do ethical justice and critical theoretical justice. And I think Girard is very difficult to critique in so much as the way he speaks about sacred violence is hard to not feel compelled by it, right? And I think what Girard presents to us, first of all, is a very important kind of narrative, which we can say is the very dominant narrative of our societies. And if you, for instance, look at Girard's Violence and the Sacred, he starts the book by basically saying that all our conception of what it means to be human starts with some kind of dark event. And that dark event becomes the basis which gives rise to meaning in our society. So we have that dark event. Now, the dark event for Girard is what he calls the original sacrifice, the original sacrifice. And what he says is that dark event actually is necessary to bring about peace, because we experience a dark event in such a way we never want to relive it again, right? So, and because certain people can experience that dark event, that can be used symbolically for us to basically regulate societies and say, look, let's make sure this never happens again. Or these people have suffered such that you don't have to suffer in the same way, right? So I think it's, and for Girard, he says, there's, we can point to a remarkable history. Now, I'll go through that history in a minute. And in that sense, then, for Girard, the sacred is precisely what makes us regulate violence, right? So we need the sacrifice, the original sacrifice, which for Girard is not a metaphor, it's literal. Somebody is sacrificed, something is sacrificed, an actual physical excessive violence. And this then allows us to regulate the social order and the social body. Now, reading Girard, and there's a whole number of important scholars who picked up on Girard. The first being Mark Juergensmeyer, who actually contributes to the 9/11 volume, which I put together. The other is Jean-Pierre Dupuy. And Dupuy's point is that what the sacred and the sacrifice really is humanity's gift. So we need the sacred in order to save us from ourselves. And if we are killing one another, it's because we are not recognizing enough the sacredness of life, right? So we need to recognize the sacredness of life. And it is precisely then the sacredness of life which gives us a better ethical appreciation of the human condition and so on. Right? All well and good. So the sacred then for Girard is a regulatory principle, but it's also a symbolic excess. So the symbolic excess becomes, it becomes the absolute annihilation which nobody else wants to kind of encounter. In other words, the sacred is the exception. It is exceptional. It's exceptional violence, right? So in Girard's thinking, you have this extreme exceptional violence. Now, I want to make a point here. I don't disagree with Girard that there can be such things as exceptional violence. I think 9/11 was exceptional, right? I think there's many forms of violence which are exceptional. And to be honest with you, I have very little time for people who will say, oh, well, 9/11, but hang about, what about these? What about, it's like, I saw somebody posting on Facebook yesterday, oh, well, 9/11, but, we had more people die of COVID yesterday, right? It's like, well, okay, what does that mean, right? What does that do for anybody who's died in any circumstance, right? It's just a flattening of history, which I think removes the context and the specificity of violence. I'm not saying we shouldn't engage in historical comparisons. And of course, we could say across the broad sweep of history, 9/11 looks pretty normal, right? But that doesn't mean to say that each particular act of violence doesn't have a novelty and let's be honest, 9/11 was a fundamental rupture in societies. And of course, we can say that it was cultured that way, it's structured that way, but I think we have to hold on to the idea that some things are exceptional. Some people are exceptional, right? Emma Raducanu, right? There's exceptional people, but there's also exceptional events, right? And there's exceptional moments. And I think, but I'm talking about the exception you're different to Agamben, because I think I want to be, and maybe we can come on to that a bit later, because I think my idea of the exception is different to Agamben. Now, what I then try to do in the book, I think, and try to work through is really, to me, I think there's no better diagnostic of any political system than violence. So we ask, what violence does a system tolerate? What violence does it produce? But more importantly, and what I've realized through doing this book is that what violence really reveals to us, particularly through the sacrifice, is what is the sacred object for different regimes of power. Right? And that to me is the way in which we understand, is the best way to understand political rationalities, political forms of domination, by asking the simple question of what is the sacred object for power. Now, what I tried to do then in the book is try to map out, I guess, especially from chapters 2 and chapter 3, is the change in genealogy or the change in nature of the different sacred reference. Now, there are, as you'll see in the book, there's a number of key journeys, key stages I go through, and I think it's important, first of all, and again, there's a lot to be said for Girard's work here, especially the ways in which he focuses very much on Greek tragedy. And I think Greek tragedy is very important in terms of understanding the history of the sacred, particularly, as I mentioned in the book, Sophocles and Oedipus Rex. And, we know how much Oedipus becomes so important as a dominant signifier, particularly post-Freud, right? So there is that point. But also, and I think Sophocles is also important because obviously, let's not forget that Sophocles, and as I mentioned in the book, he is the first to put forward the idea that human, and so we suffer into truth. And that in itself, I think, is a very sacred kind of claim.
Brad,
the second,
Brad, you froze up there. Could you just repeat the last 2 sentences?
Yep.
At least on my side, you froze up. Did Brad freeze up? Okay, yeah.
So Sophocles then is the one who basically says that humans learn to suffer into truth. Right. So, and that, of course, is we can, I'll come on to Dante in a minute, but that's a profound theological claim, actually. Or at least gets rescripted as a profound Christian claim. The second important thinker, and I think perhaps more important really in the history of the sacred and sacrifice, is Aeschylus, and particularly the Oresteia. Now, if we buy into the idea that the Oresteia is actually the very first literary text in the Western canon, the book begins, well, first of all, it begins with a a marker of technology in terms of the burning of beacons. And the burning of beacons, so the book starts with a technological problem, or the relaying of the fall of Troy, right? So there is this kind of moment where the beacon is lit. So it begins with technology. Then you have, of course, Agamemnon sacrificing his daughter Iphigenia, which is arguably one of the first cases of feminicide in Western literature, in order to appease the gods, to go to war, and so on. Now, I think this is a real important moment in terms of, thinking about politics gets bound to the question of sacrifice for the greater good. This is a real pivotal moment. You could even sacrifice your own virgin daughter in order, if the greater good was demanding, right? And this, of course, is all about competing ideas of love, right? So I think, and this is where you find securitization projects like they're working. It's all about mobilizing a particular discourse on love. The love for the people is greater than the love for the daughter. So there's a trade-off in the sacrificial model. Now we can see this later then plays out, particularly then in terms of Christian theology, the ways in which, for instance, and Girard again is important here, because what Girard says, the reason why the story of Cain and Abel becomes so important is they both offer different ontological visions of sacrifice. So there's a real important then shift in the narrative between, so Cain and Abel becomes an extension in many ways of the sacrifice of Iphigenia. So because it kind of works through this idea that there are competing visions of the sacred and the sacrificial, which can play out in any given social order. And of course, then we, as I mentioned, Christianity really arrives on the scene with the ultimate sacrifice. The ultimate sacrifice, of course, being the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. Now, I think one of the most astute, and you'd obviously expect this, but I think one of the most astute readings of the importance of the iconography of Jesus actually came from Francis Bacon, the British artist. And what Bacon says was the brilliance of Christ as an icon was all about elevation. He says, whenever you looked upon Christ, you never looked down upon him. It was all about elevation. It was all about a verticality. It was all about looking up to the sacred, looking up to the sacrifice. And of course, as Francis Bacon also went on to say, the elevation is important because what it also means is nobody can suffer the way that Christ does. So there is a heightened sacrifice in terms of he dies on the cross so we can all atone for our sins, but nobody will ever suffer the same way as him, right? Now, also, of course, the importance, and one thing I also try to deal with in the book, actually, is the ways in which then the image of Christ becomes, the life of Christ becomes a constantly recurring motif in Western ideas of the sacred. Now, one thing I wrote a lot about previously in a book on liberal terror was the recurring iconography of Pieta, Michelangelo's Pieta, and the way in which the body of the child, which is laying across the mother, is a very important iconography in ideas around the victim. Now, it became very prominent in the Ethiopian famine. You would see photographs of starving Ethiopian children on the laps of the mother, which again invokes a very particular Christian iconography. The same I also write in the book around the young drowned child, Alian Kurdi, and the ways in which that, and this is again something that was picked up by Nicholas Mirzoff, and he said the reason why that image appeals so much is precisely because it invokes an all too Christian iconography of Pieta, right? So there is a clear kind of westernized iconography to that particular kind of image. Now, what I then try to do in the book is kind of say, well, okay, and as I mentioned last week, I've never bought into the conceit of a separation between theology and secularism. And actually, secularism seems to actually, in many ways, accelerate and deepen the theological stakes. Again, why Carl Schmitt, I think, is so important as a thinker. Schmitt wasn't deluded to that. Now, what I try to argue in the book is that if the sacred object for power for Christianity was Jesus, and the myth, of course, is Christianity and the idea of the eternal God, when we enter into the space of the myth of nations, what has been called the imagined community by Benedict Anderson and so on, So you have this idea of the myth of nations. The sacred object that holds that together is the military hero. The military hero becomes the sacred object that allows for the mobilization and the consecration of identities. So in that sense, the people, the glorious dead are not in any way incidental. They are the real glue which binds nationalism together. They are the real glue which keeps this whole project together. And I think, I mentioned in the book, the importance again, of Goya. I think Francisco de Goya is so important in, I mentioned last week that I think Goya is the first to paint the death of God. The Disasters of War is basically literally drawing and bearing witness to the death of God. But also the 3rd of May painting, and I don't know if any of you know the painting, the 3rd of May, where there is the Dos de Mayo uprising, the man against the wall, about to face the firing squad, stood there with his arms aloft, and he is cloaked in white. Goya recognizes in that moment, Christ is replaced by the military hero. And it's such a powerful moment in the history of art, the history of aesthetics. And we see this, then the advent of modernity becomes the sacred object of the hero. Now, as I move through, then what I try to say is, of course, the idea of the myth of the modern nation state, of course, largely, becomes unrecoverable really with the Holocaust. Right? So the Holocaust is such a powerful moment in the history of violence and the way in which we appreciate the violence. And of course, what the Holocaust slowly, not immediately, it must be added, but slowly in the 2 decades which follow the Holocaust, what we start to see is an increasing concern with the body of the victim. Right? So the body of the victim becomes something which is far more kind of important. And thanks, Kristen, for putting that up. A powerful image, and I think you can see the evidence of the guy in the middle, the evidence symbolism of the man on the cross who replaced, and so on. So I think so what we see post-Holocaust is a shift away from the hero as being the sacred object for power. Sorry, is that me that's frozen, or was that the system?
I think your internet connection is a bit going up and down a little bit. It's not like terrible, but
let me just switch my phone off. It might be that's sucking the juice. So.
Okay, cool. Do you mind if I continue sharing screenshots?
Yeah, no, you kind of no. Please do that. So that's great. So yeah, so the Holocaust then for me, starts to then we turn to this new fixation of the sacred object of the victim, and this becomes slowly and gradually aligned with the move from the nation state as the dominant standard for political order to the emergence of global liberalism. And by the mid-1960s, global liberalism clearly starts to take the victim as the sacred object for its power. Now, it's still in a kind of infancy in terms of the way it's developed, but I think, and as I mentioned in the book, a particularly iconic moment, again, in terms of the sacredness of this, is the photograph of Kim Phuc in The Napalm Girl in Vietnam. And I think this image is so symbolic for a whole number of reasons. First of all, again, she's running down the street with her arms aloft. There's an evident young child on the cross, symbolism to the image of Phuc. But also, what's also interesting about the image of Phuc, of course, is the way in which most of the images of her scarred and burnt back are censored. It's almost more tolerable to look upon the image of a naked child than to witness the wounds on her back. And this gives rise to what I call the age of the bloodless violence of the victim. So we go towards then, so that's and you can see the evident religious symbolism of that, again, the young child, with a hidden stigmata on her back, who is another the reason why this image becomes so iconic, I argue in the book, is precisely because it looks like another adaptation of Christ on the cross. Right? So there's an evident theological reckoning at work in this image. Now, from the late 1960s onwards, for liberalism and for global liberal ambitions, the victim becomes central to its global will to planetary rule. The victim becomes a way of creating a condition of possibility for political intervention. All of this would fully mature by the early 1990s. By 1992, we enter into a period where the victim now becomes central to liberal politics. The victim, we have 20 years of talking about victimization, for instance, in the United States of America. And in many ways, the war on drugs in the 1980s becomes an important, a precursor, and also the AIDS pandemic as well, become an important precursor to the idea of human security and the shift in narrativization around victims. By 1992, we have a very prominent moment in history, in global politics. The crossing of the Mogadishu line. Somalia, for the first time in its history, the UN goes to war to save strangers. And thus begins the process from the crossing of the Mogadishu line right through the 1980s, the emergence of what we call the liberal way of war, or at least what I've called the liberal way of war. And the liberal way of war is a form of violence which overcomes the old Westphalian concern with sovereign integrities, i.e. you shouldn't intervene in another sovereign nation's affairs, precisely through the mobilization of the victim. The victim becomes something which can be appropriated, and you can actually wage war in the name of the victim. The victim becomes the sacred object for power for liberalism. Now, we see this then accelerated post 9/11. Afghanistan being the obvious example, and the appropriation of both the young child in Afghanistan, the child representing the future, and of course the woman in the burqa. Both become very iconic for global liberalism in terms of the appropriation of the victim in order to accelerate and advance the liberal will to rule. What I talk about in the book through this is how liberalism, however, gets undone by its own narcissistic ambitions, and how the myth of liberalism starts to really get undone through its own violence. You know, liberalism is a political project which was sold to us based on the ideas of planetary security, peace, prosperity, human rights, and so on. Humanitarian war shatters that myth. It actually forces us to confront not only the reality of liberal violence, and liberal violence done in the name of just war, which in itself is a profound theological doctrine, but also many critical thinkers start to reassess the entire history of liberalism. None more so than Domenico Lacerdo's brilliant book, Liberalism: A Counter-History, in which he shows that the history of liberalism coincides with the birth of the global slave trade. Liberalism invented the slave trade, it didn't resolve it. And I think Lacerdo's point is absolutely central in that kind of mapping that history. Now, what I also do in the book is to say, if the liberal way of planetary war begins in 1992 with the crossing of the Mogadishu line, by 2011, what I call the 20-year liberal war, it's exhausted in Libya. The intervention in Libya, because of all the failures of Iraq, the failures of Afghanistan, liberal societies bomb the hell out of Libya. They don't put anybody on the ground. There is no appetite whatsoever for nation building. No appetite whatsoever to believe that you could transform Libya for the better. Because liberalism is exhausted. It's morally, economically bankrupted. Liberal societies are bankrupted by 2011. There's no ambition anymore to change the world for the better. And not only that, the victim has become exhausted as a political concept. The idea that the victim can now mobilize a global politics it's been oversaturated. It's been overdone. The victim, the ontology, and actually we can see the reactions of so-called populist leaders around the world. They've rallied successfully precisely against that ontologization of the victim. Now, I'm not saying that there's only two visions of doing politics. It's not about accepting either ontological vulnerability or the populists like Trump. There's a different way of doing politics to either of those camps. But what I do think is that, we have to recognize the ways in which liberalism starts to increasingly become exhausted. And also the victim itself is so overdetermined now in politics. Everybody's a victim, right? And this becomes then a way in which, if we want a clearer example of the death of liberalism, look at Afghanistan. Right? Afghanistan was the quintessential liberal war. Even people who were very resistive to Iraq, most of them still supported Afghanistan. It was seen as the right war for the right reasons, and it failed disastrously. Because liberalism has exhausted itself. The liberal project and the liberal will to rule has exhausted itself through its violence. And I think that then to me raises the question, and I always find myself kind of going back to Nietzsche. And I think I'm really struck, first of all, in the aphorism which Nietzsche gives in Beyond Good and Evil when he talks about catastrophe. And Nietzsche says the truest meaning of a catastrophe is not a physical rupture, but it's coming face to face with the reality that the myth which used to govern you is no longer of any value whatsoever. The death of God, Nietzsche says, was a catastrophe. People had to suddenly realize that they were thrown into the world, what Heidegger calls the topos of the encounter. You're just thrown into the world, and you're thrown into a world which has no reason to ever want or need you. Right? So humans have to confront this. Now, what I've tried to deal with then in the book is to try to say, okay, well, what is the catastrophe today? What is the catastrophe now people are facing the death of liberalism? And to me, liberalism is dead. As a globally ambitious project, liberalism is dead. Right? It's over. So what then is the nature of that catastrophe? But also, I think Nietzsche's point is even more important. When Nietzsche, of course, announces the death of God, the question he then asks is, what is the new sacred object for power that's emerging through this? And what does that reveal to us about the project which claims to save us from ourselves, save us from our own excessiveness? And I don't want to kind of go into the session next week, but the point I make in the book is liberalism is being replaced by a new political order. Liberalism is no longer the dominant standard for power in the world. And the sacred object of the victim is no longer the cause for mobilization. What's being mobilized today is precisely claims that we need to sacrifice ourselves for humanity. Humanity is now the sacred object. But the only thing that's claiming to save us from ourselves is technology. So liberalism has been replaced by a global techno-theodicy. And this is what I'm arguing in the book. And again, I'll go into a couple of, hopefully we can have more of a debate next week and try to reveal why I'm not being so technologically determinist. And I'm appreciative of all those histories of debates around technology. But I think we are entering into a very new political moment in which I think we need to ask very serious questions. And I think the point I also want to kind of maybe just end on this, and then we can maybe open it up to questions. What I'm also very much interested in is precisely then the recurring motifs, and Christian motifs in particular, that constantly reappear through liberalism, and now we're seeing them being advanced through the global techno-theodicy. Now, the first thing which became very prevalent in, for instance, liberal discourses, especially from the 1990s onwards, was the idea of the massacre of the innocents, which is a very, again, profound theological doctrine which is linked to ideas of just war, especially when the massacre involves children. Now, we know, of course, the massacre of the innocents is something which very much, of course, relates back to the attempted murder of Jesus, right? So it's a very original theological proposition.
Brad, it's interesting too, that exact time frame actually transgresses something in horror film genre, which I'm not a fan of, but I've done studies with it when I was at Yale. And that was the threshold where the virgin that was always spared in the 80s in horror films, or the innocent one, was then crucified.
Absolutely. Culture's latched onto this completely, right? So, but culture also latches onto in a way in which accelerates the narrative of the victim. And you think of the ways in which, you know, from Nightmare on Elm Street onwards, actually, the acceleration and the proliferation and the massacre of innocent children in their dreams, right? Nightmare on Elm Street, what a phenomenal movie in the history of capturing this moment, right? We kill their dreams, but we kill them in their dreams. These innocent young American children. But the second point, and I was thinking a lot actually about this in terms of, I think, Taylor's important point last week around the uncorruptibility of youth. That is a profound theological Christian doctrine. The uncorruptibility of the young Jesus, the uncorruptibility of, and I think that is something which is feeding into the techno-theodicy of the age, that there is a certain now uncorruptibility of spirit, which leads to a certain Puritan kind of ideal, which goes through the heart of the techno-theodicy today. And I think there is something really that requires a lot of unpacking here, because I understand the political impetus for this. And I think it's something that demands, I think, our conversation around and our critique. So maybe we can leave there, and then I'm hoping to point